From mod to glam rock king, from pop star to movie star, there's a David Bowie for everybody. Even when you invite an art historian to talk about art, they'd rather talk about David Bowie.
Absolutely, I'm a fan of David Bowie.
But there's a version of Bowie that is less widely known.
I've been buying art since '68. It's one of my major obsessions.
We'll look at Bowie's obsessive art collection and learn what it tells us about him.
What motivated him, I think, was a sort of personal narrative. He used his collection to understand where he had come from.
And we'll learn how this personal collection shaped his own artistic output.
It clearly helped to spark ideas, to make ideas concrete.
Had it stayed together, I think it's a collection that people would make pilgrimages from all over the world to see, and I know that I certainly would.
This is the story of one man's secret obsession, the art collection of David Bowie. By the 2000s, David Bowie had amassed a substantial collection of paintings, sculptures and furniture.
David was completely non-hierarchical in every aspect of his life.
This is Bowie's art buyer and curator, Beth Greenacre.
I worked with him, looking after the collection, growing the collection, working on many art projects, actually very, very closely and intimately with David.
Beth managed the collection from London, rotating pieces in and out of Bowie's Manhattan apartment. Following the singer's death in 2016, Beth helped organise the sale of around 65% of the collection. Here's art historian Bernard Veer.
So the sale was a really big public event. It was actually the best attended exhibition that Sotheby's had ever put on.
And there were plenty of eminent artists to draw in the crowd. There was a Marcel Duchamp sculpture containing a mysterious object hidden inside a ball of string. There was a spin painting that Bowie created alongside his friend Damien Hirst. But perhaps the most notable in the catalogue was a Jean-Michel Basquiat painting entitled Air Power.
His approach to painting, in David's eyes, was musical. It was rhythmic, it was hypnotic, it had a lot of the characteristics of a musician.
In 1989, Air Power had sold for $350,000, but Basquiat's popularity declined, and 6 years later, Bowie picked up the painting for $132,000, a relative bargain. And come the sale in 2016, the painting sold for $8.8 million. That's nearly a quarter of the total $41 million sale.
£100,000. Thank you very much indeed, sir. Congratulations.
But while there were some eye-catching names, many of which turned out to be lucrative investments, that wasn't the core of his collection. Francis Christie is a senior specialist at Sotheby's and worked on the sale in 2016.
Obviously, there are some big names in his collection, but really that wasn't important to him. He collected works that meant something to him, that he responded to personally.
The contents were not necessarily what you would imagine a sort of 70s, 80s rock star to own.
The collection was described by critics as quiet and muted, but it was in this subtler side of the collection that Bowie's preoccupation lay. We'll take a look at 5 pieces from the collection, which will take us on a journey around the world to places that Bowie lived and worked. And we'll discover the secret impact this art collection had on one of the 20th century's most renowned musicians. Part 1. The Head of Gerda Bohm. David Robert Jones was born in London in 1947, growing up amongst the ruins left behind by the air raids of World War II.
London was just this terrible, tragic-looking wasteland.
An antidote to the dismal London of Bowie's childhood were the paintings of the Camden Town Group.
So the Camden Town Group, they're active before the First World War, and they start painting in these bright, non-naturalistic colours.
Of these artists, Bowie was drawn to Harold Gilman.
He does interiors of bedsits in Camden Town. Gilman has a particular love of flowery wallpaper.
The Camden School brought colour and light and frivolity to a very staid English, quite grey sort of language.
Bowie owned a work of a woman called Mrs. Mounter. And Mrs. Mounter was Gilman's landlady stroke live-in maid.
And he painted her frequently, but in pinks and blues and greens and oranges, certainly not the dreary Camden that actually would have been her life.
Alongside the Camden Group were other chroniclers of the London streets, such as David Bomberg. but also his students, Leon Kossoff and Frank Auerbach.
Auerbach and Leon Kossoff, who he was closely associated with, they are effectively sort of sculpting with paint.
The Head of Gerda Bohm by Frank Auerbach was the only painting that Bowie insisted on having permanently in his apartment in New York.
And he talked very much about how when he walked past that painting, and I can picture it in the apartment in New York, he famously said, "I want to sound like that painting looks."
Writing in the New York Times in 1998, Bowie wrote, "The work can magnify the kind of depression I'm going through, but the same painting on a different day can produce in me an incredible feeling of triumph." And he ensured that this very British core of his collection would not live behind closed doors.
He wanted to raise visibility for those artists and those voices, so he was very passionate about loaning the collection.
Part 2. Portrait of a Man. In the mid-1970s, Bowie moved to Berlin.
He'd come off a rather drug-fueled American period and was going to Germany in order to escape that in some ways.
It was here that he created his iconic album Heroes and produced the album for his Berlin roommate, Iggy Pop. Both have album artwork inspired by this Erich Heckel painting. Heckel was a German expressionist, a movement that Bowie immersed himself in during this period.
If Impressionism is all about capturing fleeting experiences and what your eye sees, then Expressionism is much more to do with how you feel about the world.
Bowie wrote how since his teenage years, he had obsessed on the angst-ridden emotional work of the Expressionists. It was an art form that mirrored life, not by event, but by mood. In this self-portrait, by Heckel, the use of woodcut and colour reflect not the reality of the scene, but his mood. Bowie spoke of his Berlin albums as expressionist mood pieces, and these albums became some of the most critically acclaimed of his career. And Bowie took up painting himself, taking inspiration from the German expressionists. Part 3. The Valentine Typewriter. By the 1980s, Bowie's music and aesthetic had moved on completely, and his collection of Memphis furniture reflects this period. The Memphis Group was active from 1980 to 1987, and its influence spread quickly across the cultural landscape.
That was completely driven by David. All I can tell you about is me sat on very uncomfortable Memphis furniture while talking with him in his office.
The Memphis Group was a collective of Italian designers who have precisely nothing to do with Memphis, Tennessee. Instead, the name came from a Bob Dylan song that was playing on repeat during their first meeting. Their founder was Ettore Sotheby.
He's an Italian designer. He designs things like the Valentine typewriter, which Bowie actually owned an example of.
The Valentine typewriter was launched on Valentine's Day 1969. Although it was an earlier design, it showed where Sotheby would eventually take the Memphis aesthetic. Bowie wrote, "I typed up many of my lyrics on that. The pure gorgeousness of it made me type." There was also the Casablanca sideboard, designed by Sotheby, the Big Sur sofa, designed by Peter Shire, and a Castiglione radio phonograph with a modular design that could be stacked in different formations. This piece was estimated to sell for $1,500, but Bowie sold for $323,000. Part 4. Austria's National Holiday. Following the success of the 1980s, Bowie began to immerse himself even more deeply in art, not only collecting it, but also writing about it for a magazine called Modern Painters.
I feel it doesn't necessarily have to just fall into the laps of the art world to write about art.
One of his colleagues at the magazine was Matthew Collings.
He was a very individual collector and made really a big impact with his collecting.
One of the impacts he made was by visiting and supporting upcoming artists. While researching for a new album in the mid-90s, he took a trip to Vienna with Brian Eno, his creative collaborator. Once again, art was at the centre of Bowie's own creative practice as he visited the Guggen Institute. This was a psychiatric hospital where patients were encouraged to practice the visual arts as a form of therapy.
Googing was an incredible experience, and we went to talk with the patients there and look at what they were doing.
They were creating art everywhere, from on trees, on walls, on floors, on toilet basins. They were just encouraged to create.
This type of work is generally known as outsider art.
There's a French artist called Henri Rousseau, and he is self-taught. He works as a customs officer, and he shows work that the avant-garde become very interested in.
One of the artists who became interested in Rousseau's work was Pablo Picasso, and the influence of naive art can be seen throughout Picasso's work, such as in this ceramic plate from Bowie's collection. During his visit to Guggen, Bowie purchased several works by the artist Johann Fischer, an Austrian whose experiences as a prisoner of war in an American prison camp led to his stay at the Institute.
I just like the sense of exploration and the lack of self-judgment about what the artists were doing.
Like all of Fischer's work, this piece, entitled Austria's National Holiday, only uses pencil and colour pencils. The interwoven sentences mirror Bowie's own approach to writing lyrics using cut-ups and collage, something he did extensively on this album. And when the album came to fruition, it borrowed its name from the art movement that inspired it. Part 5. Alexandra. It was around this time that Bowie met and married Somali-born fashion model Iman Abdulmajid. Just as Outside was being released, Bowie and Iman were invited to a photo shoot in South Africa to celebrate the end of the country's 50-year-long apartheid.
The first thing he did upon landing was go and visit as many artists as he possibly could.
Bowie visited the Johannesburg Biennale, Africus. Bowie wrote about Africus in Modern Painters, saying he found it as mind-jarringly moving as any major art thing he had seen.
But if he could, he wanted to speak to the artist. He wanted to hear firsthand the reasons or the motivations for an artist creating the work.
One of the artists he met was an unrepresented artist from Benin called Romuald Hazume. One of the pieces Bowie bought from Hazume was this mask entitled Alexandra. Hazume's tongue-in-cheek masks play on expectations and stereotypes of African art and are now highly sought after.
Well, his market is incredibly successful right now, but at that point when David first visited him, it wasn't at all.
Bowie also bought the work of Angolan artist Antonio Ole and a collection of sculptures, including an eye-catching cabinet sculpture populated by wooden figures, which sold at auction for $102,000, shattering the $10,000 estimate. The sale of Bowie's art collection set new records for 11 of the British artists included, most notably Frank Auerbach. The head of Gerda Bohm sold for $3.8 million, the most ever paid for an Auerbach.
The reason why single-owner collections are so special is because all of them are different. You discover the mind of the collector. There is no one else in the world who would curate modern British art, peppered with Memphis furniture, throw in some German expressionist, incredible woodcuts. No one else would be able to coordinate that and make it work quite like David Bowie did.
And he was convinced that those people were dangerous outsiders who lived on the edge and who captured the reality of the world via an individual vision. I think he identified with that. He thought that he saw it in a different way through his music, and he liked these artists who did that.
It was totally unexpected, and it fueled his music. I think it clearly helped to spark ideas, to make ideas concrete, and to, as he wrote, to change the way he felt. And I think when art can do that, it inspires everyone.